Beneath a torrential downpour, a millionaire crosses paths with a desperate mother, clutching two babies in her trembling arms. Driven by compassion, he approaches to help her, but what he discovers next is a secret so devastating it leaves him shattered. Yet what happens next is even more shocking. The relentless patter of rain against tinted windows did little to muffle the rhythmic purr of the Bentley Mulsanne's V8 engine. Brendan Ashworth, scion of the Ashworth financial empire, reclined in the supple leather back seat, his steel blue eyes fixed on the dreary New York cityscape beyond the glass. At 35, Brendan wore his wealth like a second skin. Savile Row suit, molded perfectly to his athletic frame, Patek Philippe watch glinting on his wrist, every detail speaking of old money and new power. Roberts, how much longer? Brendan's voice carried a hint of impatience, his fingers drumming against the mahogany trim. The chauffeur's reply came through the intercom, steady and practiced. Traffic's heavy due to the weather, sir. Another 20 minutes to the penthouse, I'm afraid. Brendan suppressed a sigh, reaching for his smartphone. The device, worth more than most people's monthly salary, illuminated with notifications, stock alerts, messages from board members, invitations to galas and charity events. The life of America's youngest billionaire never slowed, even on a miserable Tuesday afternoon. As the Bentley inched forward, Brendan's gaze drifted back to the rain-slicked streets. That's when he saw her, a woman, no more than 30, huddled beneath the meager shelter of a bus stop. Her clothes, though once of good quality, were soaked and bedraggled. But it wasn't the woman alone that caught Brendan's attention. Clinging to her were two small children, a boy and a girl, both trying to seek warmth and protection from their mother's embrace. "Roberts, pull over," Brendan heard himself say, surprising even himself with the command. The chauffeur hesitated. "Sir, you heard me. Pull over. Now." As the Bentley glided to a stop, Brendan found himself opening the door, stepping out into the deluge. Rain immediately soaked through his bespoke suit, but he barely noticed. He approached the bus stop, aware of the woman's wary gaze following his every move. "Excuse me," Brendan began, feeling strangely out of his depth. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you all right?" The woman's eyes, a startling shade of green, met his. There was fear there and pride, and a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, her voice hoarse but carrying a hint of refinement that belied her current state. Brendan glanced at the children, both shivering despite their mother's attempts to shield them. The boy, no more than 6, stared up at him with wide, curious eyes. The girl, younger still, had her face buried in her mother's neck. "Please," Brendan found himself saying, "let me give you a ride. Wherever you need to go, it's no trouble." The woman's grip on her children tightened. "That's very kind, but we don't accept rides from strangers." "I understand," Brendan nodded, rainwater dripping from his perfectly coiffed hair. "I'm Brendan Ashworth. And you are?" A flicker of recognition passed across the woman's face at the mention of his name. "Scarlett," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Scarlett Reeves." "Well, Scarlett Reeves, now we're not strangers anymore." Brendan attempted a smile, acutely aware of how bizarre this situation was. "Please, I insist. No one should be out in this weather, especially not children." Scarlett looked down at her kids, conflict clear on her face. The boy tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, I'm cold." That seemed to make up her mind. With a resigned nod, she stood, gathering her children close. "All right, Mr. Ashworth. Thank you." As Brendan led them to the Bentley, he could feel Robert's questioning gaze through the rearview mirror. "Change of plans," he announced as they settled into the back seat, the leather creaking beneath their wet clothes. "We're making a detour." "Where to, sir?" Roberts asked, his tone carefully neutral. Brendan looked at Scarlett, who sat rigid, her children pressed close on either side. "Where can we take you, Ms. Reeves?" Scarlett's laugh was hollow, tinged with bitterness. "That's the question, isn't it? We don't really have anywhere to go right now." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Brendan felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. Without fully thinking it through, he heard himself say, "Then you'll come to my place just until you figure things out." Scarlett's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Ashworth, that's not necessary. We couldn't possibly—" "Please," Brendan interrupted, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. "I have more than enough space. It's just until the storm passes, at least." As the Bentley pulled away from the curb, Brendan caught Robert's eye in the mirror. The chauffeur's expression was unreadable, but Brendan could imagine what he must be thinking. This wasn't like him. Brendan Ashworth, known for his shrewd business acumen and somewhat cold demeanor, didn't make a habit of picking up strays. The drive to Brendan's penthouse was silent, punctuated only by the occasional sniffle from one of the children. Scarlett sat ramrod straight, her eyes darting between her kids and the passing scenery of Manhattan's elite Upper East Side. When they finally pulled into the private underground garage of Brendan's building, Scarlett's sharp intake of breath was audible. The garage itself was a testament to wealth, housing a collection of luxury vehicles that would make any car enthusiast weep. "Come," Brendan said, stepping out of the car. "Let's get you all dried off." The elevator ride to the penthouse was tense, the small space amplifying the contrast between Brendan's polished appearance, despite the rain, and Scarlett's bedraggled state. The children, however, seemed to have shaken off some of their initial fear, their eyes wide as they took in the gilded elevator interior. As the doors slid open, revealing the penthouse foyer, Scarlett couldn't suppress a gasp. The space was a masterpiece of modern luxury, soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of rain-drenched Manhattan, and art pieces worth more than most homes adorning the walls. "Mrs. Henderson," Brendan called out, and an elegant older woman appeared from one of the adjoining rooms. Her eyes widened fractionally at the sight of the dripping group, but her composure never faltered. "Yes, Mr. Ashworth. Please prepare the guest rooms in the East Wing, and find some dry clothes for Ms. Reeves and her children." Brendan turned to Scarlett. "Mrs. Henderson is my housekeeper. She'll take care of everything you need." Mrs. Henderson nodded, her gaze lingering on Scarlett and the children with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Of course, sir, right away." She gestured for Scarlett to follow her. "This way, please. Let's get you all warmed up." As Scarlett and her children disappeared down the hallway with Mrs. Henderson, Brendan found himself alone in the foyer, water pooling at his feet on the imported marble tiles. He ran a hand through his damp hair, the reality of what he'd just done beginning to sink in. He'd brought strangers into his home, into his carefully ordered world. It was impulsive, potentially dangerous, and completely out of character. And yet, as he recalled the look in Scarlett's eyes, that mix of pride and desperation, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Brendan made his way to his study, a space that perfectly encapsulated his world. Mahogany desk worth a small fortune, walls lined with first editions and financial texts, a bar stocked with liquor more expensive than most cars. He poured himself 2 fingers of 30-year-old Macallan, the amber liquid a warm contrast to the grey day outside. As he sipped the scotch, his mind raced. Who was Scarlett Reeves? How had she ended up on that street corner? And why did he, Brendan Ashworth, notorious for his aloofness and detachment, feel so compelled to help her? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Mrs. Henderson with an update. Instead, it was Scarlett who entered, now dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loosely on her frame. Her damp hair was pulled back, revealing a face that, while tired and drawn, held a quiet beauty. "Mr. Ashworth," she began, her voice low, I don't know how to thank you." Brendan waved off her gratitude, suddenly uncomfortable. "It's nothing, really. Are the children settled?" Scarlett nodded. "Yes. Mrs. Henderson found them some clothes and they're resting now." She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Mr. Ashworth, I feel I need to explain—" "You don't owe me any explanations, Ms. Reeves," Brendan interrupted, surprising himself with his own words. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to get back on your feet." Scarlett's eyes widened, a mix of gratitude and suspicion crossing her face. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this for strangers?" It was a fair question, one Brendan himself wasn't sure he could answer. He took another sip of scotch, buying time. "I'm not sure," he admitted finally, but it felt like the right thing to do. A moment of understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the strange circumstances that had brought them together. As Scarlett opened her mouth to respond, a small voice called from the hallway. "Mommy?" Scarlett turned, her entire demeanor softening. "I should go," she said to Brendan. "Thank you again, Mr. Ashworth, truly." As she left the study, Brendan found himself staring at the closed door, the taste of expensive scotch on his tongue, a stark reminder of the world he inhabited, a world that, until today, had felt complete. Now, with the presence of Scarlett and her children just down the hall, that world seemed to have shifted on its axis. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the New York skyline, but inside the penthouse, something had changed. Brendan Ashworth, master of the financial universe, found himself standing on unfamiliar ground, about to embark on a journey he could never have anticipated when he woke up that morning. The stage was set, the players introduced, and as the day faded into evening, the story of Brendan and Scarlett, of wealth and struggle, of unexpected kindness and hidden truths, was only just beginning. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the previous day's gloom. Brendan, dressed impeccably in a tailored Tom Ford suit, paused in the hallway outside the guest rooms. The penthouse was quiet, save for the faint sounds of life stirring behind closed doors. He hesitated, hand raised to knock, then thought better of it. With a shake of his head, he continued to the kitchen. Mrs. Henderson was already there, efficiently preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Ashworth," she greeted, her tone carefully neutral. "Shall I set the table for 4? Brendan nodded, reaching for the carafe of freshly brewed coffee. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Henderson. And perhaps some child-friendly options?" A flicker of surprise crossed the housekeeper's face before she composed herself. "Of course, sir. I'll see to it right away." As Brendan sipped his coffee, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline, he heard soft footsteps approaching. He turned to see Scarlett entering the kitchen, her children in tow. The boy, wide-eyed and curious, clutched his mother's hand. The little girl, still shy, clung to Scarlett's leg. "Good morning," Brendan offered, trying to keep his tone light. "I hope you all slept well." Scarlett nodded, her posture tense. "We did, thank you." "Mr. Ashworth, I want to thank you again for your kindness, but we really should be going. We've imposed enough already." Brendan set down his coffee cup, brow furrowing. "Going where exactly?" "Ms. Reeves, forgive me for being blunt, but you said yourself last night that you had nowhere to go." A flash of anger crossed Scarlett's face, quickly replaced by resignation. "We'll figure something out. We always do." "Mommy," the little boy tugged at Scarlett's borrowed shirt, his voice a stage whisper. "It smells good here, can't we stay for breakfast?" Brendan saw the conflict play out on Scarlett's face, pride warring with practicality. He decided to press his advantage. "Please, at least have breakfast with me. We can discuss your options afterward." After a moment's hesitation, Scarlett nodded. "All right, thank you." As Mrs. Henderson efficiently set the table, Brendan found himself studying the little family. The boy, curiosity overcoming his initial shyness, was peppering Mrs. Henderson with questions about the elaborate place settings. The girl remained silent, but her eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," Brendan said, kneeling down to the children's eye level. "I'm Brendan, what are your names?" The boy puffed out his chest. "I'm Max. I'm 6.5. He pointed to his sister. "That's Lily. She's 4, but she doesn't talk much." Brendan smiled, genuinely charmed. "It's very nice to meet you both, Max and Lily." As they settled around the table, the contrast between Brendan's world and Scarlett's became even more apparent. The children's eyes widened at the array of food before them. Fresh fruit, fluffy pancakes, eggs prepared 3 ways. Scarlett looked overwhelmed, her hands shaking slightly as she helped Lily cut her pancakes. "So, Ms. Reeves," Brendan began, trying to keep his tone conversational. "What brought you to New York?" Scarlett's eyes met his, guarded. "Work initially, but things didn't pan out as expected." "What kind of work?" "I was in finance, actually. Junior analyst." She gave a bitter laugh. "Seems like a lifetime ago now." Brendan's eyebrows rose. This was unexpected. "Finance? Which firm, if you don't mind my asking?" Scarlett hesitated, pushing food around her plate. "Ashworth Global Investments." The silence that followed was deafening. Brendan felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I see," he managed finally. "That's my family's company." "I know," Scarlett replied, her voice tight. "That's why I was reluctant to accept your help, Mr. Ashworth. But desperate times." The implications hung heavy in the air. Brendan's mind raced. What had happened? Why had Scarlett left? And how had she ended up on the streets? Before he could formulate a response, his phone buzzed insistently. Brendan glanced at it, frowning. "I'm sorry, I have to take this. Excuse me for a moment." He stepped into the hallway, bringing the phone to his ear. "Marcus, what is it?" Marcus Roth, Brendan's right-hand man and head of legal for Ashworth Global, didn't bother with pleasantries. "Brendan, we've got a situation. The SEC is sniffing around our Southeast Asian holdings. I need you in the office now." Brendan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Can't you handle it?" "Not this time, boss. We need to present a united front. Your father's legacy is at stake here." At the mention of his father, Brendan felt the familiar weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. "Fine. I'll be there in an hour." Returning to the dining room, Brendan found Mrs. Henderson clearing the table while Scarlett helped the children clean up. "I'm sorry, but I have to go into the office. It's an emergency." Scarlett nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Of course. We'll be out of your way shortly." "No," Brendan said more forcefully than he intended. "Please, stay. At least for today. Give yourself some time to figure things out. Mrs. Henderson will see to anything you need." Scarlett opened her mouth to protest, but Max interrupted. "Can we stay, Mommy? Please. Mr. Brendan has a big TV and Lily likes the view." Brendan saw Scarlett's resolve crumble. "All right," she conceded. "Just for today." As Brendan left for the office, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The SEC investigation, Scarlett's revelation, the mystery of her fall from grace, it was all connected, he was sure of it. But how? The sleek offices of Ashworth Global Investments stood in stark contrast to the warm chaos of the morning's breakfast. As Brendan strode through the corridors, employees scrambled to look busy, their fear and respect palpable. Marcus met him at the door to the conference room, looking harried. "They're waiting for us. Remember, we deny everything. We've done nothing wrong." Brendan nodded, slipping into the role of the cold, calculating businessman. But as he took his seat across from the SEC investigators, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a dangerous question. What if we have? The meeting dragged on for hours, a dance of carefully worded statements and veiled threats. By the time it was over, Brendan felt drained, his earlier empathy buried under layers of corporate strategy. As the SEC team filed out, Marcus clapped him on the back. "Well done, Brendan, your father would be proud." The words, meant as a compliment, left a bitter taste in Brendan's mouth. "Would he, Marcus? Sometimes I wonder." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What's gotten into you lately? You've been distracted, soft even. Is there something I should know?" Brendan thought of Scarlett and her children, waiting in his penthouse. "No," he lied smoothly. "Nothing at all." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls. It was past 9 when Brendan finally made it back to the penthouse, his tie loosened and jacket slung over his arm. He found Scarlett in the living room, staring out at the twinkling city lights. The children were nowhere to be seen. "They're asleep," Scarlett said, answering his unspoken question. "Mrs. Henderson helped me put them to bed." Brendan nodded, pouring himself a drink. He offered one to Scarlett, who hesitated before accepting. "Ms. Reeves," he began, then stopped. "Scarlett, I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Scarlett's grip tightened on her glass. "About what, Mr. Ashworth?" "About why you left Ashworth Global. About how you ended up on that street corner." He paused, meeting her eyes. "About what really happened." For a long moment, Scarlett was silent. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." And so as the night deepened and the city hummed below, Scarlett began to talk. She spoke of her time at Ashworth Global, of her rise through the ranks, of the irregularities she began to notice in certain accounts. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice hollow, "reporting it to my superiors. I never imagined—" Brendan listened, his heart sinking with each word. The picture Scarlett painted was one of corruption, of powerful men protecting their interests at any cost. Men like his father. "They didn't just fire me," Scarlett continued, tears now flowing freely. "They destroyed me, blacklisted me from every financial institution in the city, froze my assets. I lost everything, my home, my savings, my reputation." "But why?" Brendan asked, struggling to reconcile this story with the company he thought he knew. "Why go to such lengths?" Scarlett's laugh was bitter. "Because I had proof, Brendan. Proof that could bring down the entire Ashworth empire. Or at least I did." "Did?" She shook her head. "It's gone now. Lost when we lost our home. All I have left are the kids and the clothes on our backs." Brendan sat back, his mind reeling. If what Scarlett was saying was true, and deep down he believed it was, then everything he thought he knew about his family, his legacy, was a lie. "I want to help you," he said finally, "but I need to understand everything, every detail." Scarlett looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time. "Why? Why would you risk everything to help us?" Brendan thought about the fear in Lily's eyes, the brave front Max put on. He thought about Scarlett, brilliant and broken, a victim of the very system he had benefited from his entire life. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I think maybe helping you might be the key to saving myself." As the night wore on, Brendan and Scarlett talked. They pieced together the puzzle of corruption and deceit that had led them to this moment. And slowly, a plan began to form. It would be dangerous. It would mean going against everything Brendan had been raised to believe in. It would mean risking his fortune, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom. But as he looked at Scarlett, saw the hope beginning to dawn in her eyes, Brendan knew he had no choice. The Ashworth Empire was built on lies and the suffering of people like Scarlett. It was time for the truth to come out. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the New York skyline, Brendan made a vow. He would right the wrongs of his family's past, no matter the cost. And he would start by helping Scarlett reclaim her life and her dignity. The game was on, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Brendan Ashworth, heir to a corrupt empire, was about to become its biggest threat, and Scarlett Reeves, the woman who had lost everything, might just be the key to bringing it all crashing down. In the quiet of the early morning, as Scarlett finally succumbed to exhaustion on the plush sofa, Brendan retreated to his study. He booted up his computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as he began to dig into the company's records. If Scarlett's story was true, and his gut told him it was, the evidence had to be there somewhere. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Brendan barely noticed, his eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets and financial reports. He was so engrossed that he didn't hear the soft knock at first. "Mr. Ashworth," Mrs. Henderson's voice finally penetrated his concentration. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but the children are asking for their mother." Brendan blinked, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. "Of course, thank you, Mrs. Henderson, I'll wake Scarlett." As he made his way to the living room, Brendan's mind raced. He had found discrepancies in the company's books, subtle but definitely there. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was a start. Scarlett was already stirring when he entered, her eyes widening as she took in the sunlight streaming through the windows. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep here." "It's all right," Brendan assured her. "But the kids are asking for you. Why don't you go to them? We can talk more later." As Scarlett hurried off to tend to her children, Brendan found himself staring after her, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. Empathy, certainly, and a growing sense of injustice. But there was something else too, something he wasn't quite ready to name. The day passed in a blur of activity. Brendan worked from home, using the excuse of a minor illness to avoid the office. In between conference calls and emails, he watched Scarlett with her children. Max's endless energy and curiosity, Lily's quiet but observant nature. They were good kids, resilient despite the hardships they'd faced. It was during a lull in the afternoon that Max approached Brendan, his small face serious. "Mr. Brendan," he began, "are you going to help us? Mommy says we might have to leave soon, but I don't want to. I like it here." Brendan felt his heart clench. He knelt down to Max's level, meeting the boy's earnest gaze. "I'm going to try, Max. I promise you that." Max nodded solemnly. "Good, because Lily likes it here too. She told me so." As Max scampered off to rejoin his sister, Brendan felt the weight of his promise settle on his shoulders. These children deserved stability, safety, and Scarlett deserved justice. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Brendan and Scarlett sat down to strategize. Brendan shared what he'd found in the company records, while Scarlett filled in more details about the irregularities she'd noticed during her time at Ashworth Global. "The real proof was in a set of encrypted files," Scarlett explained, frustration evident in her voice. "I had them on a secure drive, but when they came for me, I lost everything." Brendan leaned forward, his mind racing. But if those files existed once, they must still exist somewhere. Nothing is ever truly deleted in the digital age. Scarlett's eyes widened with realization. "You're right, but accessing them, it would be nearly impossible. The security at Ashworth Global is top-notch." A slow smile spread across Brendan's face. Nearly impossible, yes, but not entirely impossible, especially not for someone with insider access. As they began to formulate a plan, the air between them crackled with a mix of excitement and fear. What they were considering was dangerous, potentially illegal, but the alternative, allowing the corruption to continue unchecked, was unthinkable. Days turned into weeks. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Brendan continued to play the role of the dutiful CEO, attending board meetings and charity galas. But behind the scenes, he and Scarlett worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of Ashworth Global's misdeeds. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and close calls. Once, Marcus nearly caught Brendan accessing restricted files. Another time, a board member commented on Brendan's new philanthropic interests after spotting him with Scarlett and the kids at a public park. But slowly, surely, they made progress. And as they worked together, something else began to grow between Brendan and Scarlett. A partnership, a friendship, and perhaps something more. It was Lily who first made Brendan confront these growing feelings. One evening, as he was saying goodnight to the children, the usually silent girl reached out and took his hand. "Are you going to be our new daddy?" she asked, her voice small but clear. Brendan felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. He looked up to see Scarlett standing in the doorway, her face a mix of embarrassment and something else he couldn't quite read. That's not," Brendan stammered, for once at a loss for words. Scarlett came to his rescue, gently ushering Lily back to bed. "That's not how it works, sweetheart. Mr. Ashworth is our friend. Now say goodnight." The incident with Lily lingered in Brendan's mind, a constant undercurrent to his thoughts as he navigated the treacherous waters of his dual life. By day, he was still Brendan Ashworth, CEO of Ashworth Global Investments, the golden boy of Wall Street. But in the evenings, ensconced in his penthouse with Scarlett and the children, he was becoming someone else entirely, someone he was starting to like far more than his public persona. It was a crisp autumn morning when Brendan made the decision that would change everything. He sat in his home office, staring at the dossier on his desk, a comprehensive background check on Scarlett Reeves, commissioned in secret and delivered discreetly by a private investigator. He hadn't told Scarlett about this. It felt like a betrayal of the trust they'd built over the past weeks. But as much as he wanted to believe her story unconditionally, the businessman in him demanded verification. With a deep breath, he opened the file. Hours passed as Brendan pored over the contents. Bank statements, employment records, court documents, a paper trail that painted a picture both heartbreaking and infuriating. Everything Scarlett had told him was true, and the reality was even worse than he'd imagined. He read about Scarlett's meteoric rise at Ashworth Global, her exemplary performance reviews. Then came the irregularities she'd reported, followed by a swift and brutal fall from grace. False accusations of embezzlement, character assassination in the press, a legal battle she couldn't hope to win against the army of lawyers Ashworth Global had at its disposal. Brendan's hands shook as he read the final pages, reports of Scarlett's desperate attempts to find work, of being turned away from every financial institution in the city, the loss of her home, her savings drained by legal fees, the heart-wrenching decision to pull Max out of his private school, to give up Lily's spot at an exclusive preschool. "Oh God," Brendan whispered, his voice breaking the silence of the room. He felt physically ill, the weight of his family's sins crushing down on him. A soft knock at the door startled him. "Brendan," Scarlett's voice called, "is everything okay? You've been in here all day." Brendan hastily shoved the dossier into a drawer. "Come in," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. Scarlett entered, concern etched on her face. She'd changed in the weeks since they'd met, the haunted look in her eyes gradually replaced by something warmer, more hopeful. It made what Brendan had to tell her all the more difficult. "Scarlett," he began, then faltered. How could he admit what he'd done? How could he tell her that his family, his company, had systematically destroyed her life? But Scarlett was perceptive. Her eyes darted to the partially open drawer, widening as she caught a glimpse of the papers inside. "What is that?" she asked, her voice suddenly cold. Brendan closed his eyes, steeling himself. "I had you investigated," he admitted. "I needed to know, to be sure I wasn't lying." Scarlett's voice rose, anger and hurt battling for dominance. "After everything we've been through, you still didn't trust me. It's not that simple. Brendan tried to explain, rising from his chair. "I wanted to trust you, but I needed proof. Proof that could stand up in court, that could bring down the people responsible." Scarlett laughed bitterly. "And what did you find, Mr. Ashworth? Was it everything you hoped for?" "It was worse," Brendan said quietly. "So much worse than I could have imagined. Scarlett, I'm so sorry. What my family did to you, it's unforgivable." The anger seemed to drain out of Scarlett, leaving only a bone-deep weariness. She sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. "So now you know," she said. "Every humiliating detail. Are you satisfied?" Brendan moved around the desk, kneeling in front of her. "No," he said fiercely. "I'm not satisfied. I'm furious. At my father, at the board, at myself for being so blind for so long. But Scarlett, don't you see? This changes everything. With this evidence we can bring them down. We can get you justice." Scarlett looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you risk everything? Your wealth, your position, your family legacy. For me?" Brendan took her hands in his, a gesture that felt both foreign and completely natural. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I care about you, Scarlett. You and the kids. More than I ever thought possible." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. For a moment, Brendan thought Scarlett might pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hands, a single tear tracking down her cheek. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, so what do we do now?" The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Brendan and Scarlett pored over the evidence, building a case that would be impossible to ignore. They worked late into the night, fueled by a combination of righteous anger and growing hope. But as they delved deeper into the corruption at the heart of Ashworth Global, new challenges emerged. Brendan discovered that the unethical practices went far beyond what they'd initially believed. It wasn't just about silencing Scarlett. There was a pattern of intimidation, of crushing anyone who dared to question the company's methods. One evening, as they sat surrounded by stacks of documents, Brendan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's not just about financial fraud," he said. "They've been manipulating markets, pressuring regulators. God, Scarlett, they even have judges in their pocket. How did I not see this?" Scarlett looked up from her laptop, her face etched with sympathy. "You weren't meant to see it, Brendan. They kept you insulated, groomed you to take over without questioning the uglier parts of the business." Brendan stood abruptly, pacing the room. "That's no excuse. I should have known. I should have asked questions. All those people we crushed, lives we ruined. I'm complicit in all of it." "Hey," Scarlett said softly, rising to intercept his agitated pacing. She placed a hand on his arm, stilling him. "You're not responsible for your father's sins. What matters is what you do now." Brendan looked down at her, conflict raging in his eyes. "But he's my father, Scarlett. For all his faults, he raised me, gave me everything. How can I betray him like this?" "Is it really betrayal to stand up for what's right?" Scarlett countered. "Think about Max and Lily. What kind of world do you want them to grow up in? One where the powerful can crush the innocent without consequence." Her words struck home, cutting through Brendan's turmoil. He thought of the children, of their resilience and hope in the face of adversity. He thought of all the other families like Scarlett's, lives torn apart by corporate greed. "You're right," he said finally, his resolve hardening. "We have to do this, no matter the cost." As they redoubled their efforts, Scarlett began to open up more about her past. Late one night, as they took a break from their work, she told Brendan about her childhood in a working-class neighborhood in Queens. "My parents worked so hard," she said, a fond smile playing on her lips. "Dad was a mechanic, Mom worked at a diner. They saved every penny to send me to college. I was the first in our family to get a degree." Brendan listened, fascinated by this glimpse into a world so different from his own privileged upbringing. "They must be so proud of you," he said. Scarlett's smile faltered. "They were. They passed away a few years ago. Car accident. It's just been me and the kids since then." "I'm so sorry," Brendan said, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "I had no idea." Scarlett squeezed back, drawing strength from the contact. "It's okay. They got to see me land the job at Ashworth Global. They were so excited. They thought I'd made it, you know, that all their sacrifices had paid off." The irony of it wasn't lost on Brendan. "And then we took it all away," he said quietly. Not you, Scarlett corrected him. The company, your father. But you're different, Brendan. You're trying to make it right. As she spoke, Brendan felt something shift inside him. The last vestiges of loyalty to his father, to the Ashworth name, crumbled away. In their place was a fierce determination to see justice done, not just for Scarlett, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of Ashworth Global. We're going to fix this, he promised, his voice low and intense. We're going to take them down, Scarlett. All of them. The next morning, Brendan woke early, his mind clear and focused. He dressed with care, selecting one of his finest suits. Today wasn't just another day at the office. It was the beginning of the end for Ashworth Global as it currently existed. As he knotted his tie, Scarlett appeared in the doorway of his bedroom. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Brendan met her eyes in the mirror. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. "It's time to confront my father." Scarlett nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was about to do. "Be careful," she said softly. "These people, they're dangerous, Brendan. They won't hesitate to destroy you if they realize what you're doing." Brendan turned to face her, reaching out to cup her cheek gently. "I know, but I have something they don't, something worth fighting for." For a moment, they stood there, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then Brendan leaned in, pressing a soft, almost hesitant kiss to Scarlett's lips. It was brief but filled with promise. As he pulled away, Scarlett's eyes fluttered open, a mix of surprise and something warmer in their depths. "What was that for?" she whispered. Brendan smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "For giving me the courage to do what's right, for showing me what really matters." With one last look at Scarlett, Brendan squared his shoulders and headed out. The elevator ride to the garage felt longer than usual, each floor bringing him closer to a confrontation that would change everything. As his driver navigated the morning traffic, Brendan's mind raced. He reviewed the evidence they'd gathered, rehearsed what he would say to his father, but underlying it all was a sense of calm, of rightness. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly living up to the Ashworth name, not by perpetuating corruption, but by having the courage to stand against it. The imposing facade of Ashworth Global's headquarters loomed before him, glass and steel stretching skyward. As Brendan stepped out of the car, he took a deep breath, savoring the crisp autumn air. It felt like a new beginning. In the elevator, rising swiftly to the executive floor, Brendan steeled himself for what was to come. The doors opened, revealing the familiar landscape of power and privilege, plush carpets, expensive art, the hushed tones of serious business being conducted. His father's secretary looked up as he approached, a polite smile plastered on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Ashworth. Your father wasn't expecting you this early. Shall I let him know you're here?" Brendan shook his head. "No need, Sandra. I'll surprise him." Without waiting for a response, he strode towards the imposing double doors of his father's office. As he placed his hand on the doorknob, Brendan hesitated for just a moment. On the other side of this door was everything he'd been raised to value: wealth, power, the Ashworth legacy. But he thought of Scarlett, of Max and Lily, of all the lives that had been trampled in the pursuit of profit. With a deep breath, Brendan opened the door and stepped into his father's office, ready to confront the truth and change the course of his family's history forever. The heavy oak doors of Richard Ashworth's office swung shut behind Brendan with a muted thud. His father looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a practiced smile. "Brendan, my boy," Richard said, rising to greet his son. "To what do I owe this early morning pleasure?" Brendan stood his ground, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. "We need to talk, Dad. About the company. About what we've done." Richard's smile faltered, replaced by a wary look. "What we've done? We've built an empire, son. Something to be proud of." "Have we?" Brendan countered, stepping closer to the desk. "Or have we built it on the backs of people we've crushed along the way?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Richard's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "Where is this coming from, Brendan? Has someone been filling your head with nonsense?" Brendan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I know about Scarlett Reeves, Dad. I know what the company did to her, and to others like her, and I can't be a part of it anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went through a series of emotions: shock, anger, calculation, before settling into a mask of cold fury. "You've been investigating the company," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Your own family for what? Some disgruntled ex-employee?" "For the truth," Brendan shot back. "And Scarlett isn't just some ex-employee. She's a woman whose life we destroyed because she dared to speak up about our illegal practices." Richard slammed his hand on the desk, making Brendan flinch despite himself. "Enough! You have no idea what it takes to run a company like this, to compete in this world. Sometimes hard decisions have to be made for the greater good." "The greater good?" Brendan echoed incredulously. "How is ruining innocent lives for profit the greater good?" "You're naive, son," Richard said, his voice softening slightly. "The world isn't black and white. We provide jobs, create wealth. Yes, sometimes people get hurt in the process, but that's business." Brendan shook his head, a mixture of disappointment and resolve settling over him. "No, Dad, that's not business. That's corruption, and I won't be a part of it anymore." Richard's eyes widened as the implications of Brendan's words sank in. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to make this right," Brendan said firmly. "I'm going to expose everything. The fraud, the intimidation, all of it. And I'm going to make sure Scarlett and everyone else we've wronged gets justice." The look of betrayal on his father's face was almost enough to make Brendan waver. Almost. But he thought of Scarlett, of her children, of all the others whose lives had been upended by Ashworth Global's greed. "You would destroy everything we've built?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've worked for. Everything I plan to leave to you." Brendan straightened, meeting his father's gaze. "If it means doing what's right, then yes. I'm sorry, Dad, but this ends now." As Brendan turned to leave, his father's voice stopped him. "You walk out that door, Brendan, and you're no longer my son. You'll have nothing, no money, no position, no future in this industry. Is that what you want?" For a moment, Brendan hesitated, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Then he thought of Scarlett's strength, of the trust she'd placed in him. He thought of Max's curious eyes and Lily's shy smile. "What I want," he said quietly, "is to be able to look at myself in the mirror and be proud of who I am. Goodbye, Dad." With that, Brendan walked out, leaving behind the only world he'd ever known. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. True to his word, Richard Ashworth moved swiftly to cut Brendan off from the family fortune and connections. Brendan found his credit cards cancelled, his accounts frozen, his contacts in the industry suddenly unreachable. But far from breaking him, the adversity only strengthened Brendan's resolve. He threw himself into building their case, working tirelessly alongside Scarlett to gather evidence and plan their next moves. Scarlett, for her part, watched Brendan's transformation with a mixture of admiration and cautious hope. One evening, as they pored over financial records in Brendan's study, she finally broached the subject. "Why are you really doing this, Brendan?" she asked softly. "You've lost everything. Your family, your fortune, your future. Is it really worth it?" Brendan looked up from the documents, his eyes meeting hers. "I haven't lost everything," he said. "I've gained something far more valuable. A purpose. A chance to make things right." He paused, a small smile playing on his lips. "And I've gained you and the kids, if you'll have me, that is." Scarlett felt a warmth spread through her chest, but years of hardship had taught her caution. "Brendan, we can't be your replacement family. This isn't a fairy tale." "I know that," Brendan said earnestly. "I'm not looking for a replacement anything. I'm looking for a fresh start, a chance to be the man I should have been all along. And I want to do that with you, Scarlett, if you'll give me the chance." Scarlett studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "but we take this one day at a time. Deal?" Brendan's smile widened. Deal. As days turned into weeks, their partnership deepened both personally and professionally. They developed a rhythm, Brendan's business acumen complementing Scarlett's detailed knowledge of the company's inner workings. One breakthrough came when they managed to access encrypted files from Scarlett's old work computer. Brendan had called in a favor from a college friend, now a brilliant but eccentric hacker. "I can't believe it," Scarlett breathed, staring at the screen as file after file appeared. "It's all here. Every shady deal, every cooked book. We've got them." Brendan squeezed her shoulder, his touch sending a now familiar warmth through her. "You did it, Scarlett. You kept fighting even when everything was stacked against you. You're incredible." Scarlett turned to him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, Brendan." Their eyes met, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Slowly, inevitably, they leaned towards each other. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain. It felt like a promise, like coming home. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Scarlett couldn't help but laugh softly. "What?" Brendan asked, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "Nothing," Scarlett said, shaking her head. "It's just, a year ago I was at rock bottom. I never could have imagined this." Brendan's expression softened. "You're the strongest person I know, Scarlett. You would have found a way with or without me. I'm just grateful I get to be part of your story." As they turned back to their work, both felt a shift in their relationship. The last walls of distrust had crumbled, replaced by a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and growing love. The next challenge came in the form of Marcus Roth, Brendan's former right-hand man at Ashworth Global. Marcus had always been more loyal to the company than to Brendan personally, and his unexpected visit to the penthouse set off alarm bells. "Brendan," Marcus said, his tone carefully neutral as Brendan let him in. "We need to talk." Brendan led him to the living room, where Scarlett was helping Max with his homework. The domestic scene clearly threw Marcus off balance. "Marcus," Brendan said evenly, "what can I do for you?" Marcus's eyes darted between Brendan and Scarlett, understanding dawning on his face. "So, the rumors are true," he said. "You've thrown everything away for this." Brendan felt Scarlett tense beside him. "I haven't thrown anything away," he said firmly. "I've chosen to stand for what's right. Now what do you want?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me, Brendan. There's still time to fix this. Your father is willing to welcome you back, to forget this lapse in judgment. All you have to do is cut ties with her." He nodded towards Scarlett. "And turn over any evidence you've gathered." Brendan felt a surge of anger, but before he could respond, Scarlett spoke up. "And what about justice, Mr. Roth?" she asked, her voice steady. "What about all the people Ashworth Global has hurt? Do we just forget about them?" Marcus's lip curled slightly. "Justice is a luxury, Ms. Reeves. Survival is what matters. And right now, Brendan's survival in this industry hinges on him making the right choice." Brendan stood, his decision made. "I have made the right choice, Marcus. I'm sorry you can't see that. I think it's time for you to leave." As he showed Marcus out, the other man turned to him one last time. "Think carefully, Brendan. You're playing a dangerous game. These people, they won't hesitate to destroy you completely." Brendan met his gaze steadily. "Let them try." As the door closed behind Marcus, Brendan leaned against it, suddenly feeling the weight of their situation. Scarlett approached him, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Brendan nodded, pulling her into an embrace. "I'm fine. But Marcus is right about one thing. This is going to get ugly. Are you sure you're ready for what's coming?" Scarlett pulled back slightly, meeting his eyes. "I've been fighting this battle alone for years, Brendan. Having you by my side, it makes all the difference. We can do this. Together." As they stood there holding each other, both were acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead, but they also felt a sense of hope, of purpose, that neither had experienced before. The next few months were a roller coaster of highs and lows. Brendan and Scarlett worked tirelessly, building their case piece by painstaking piece. They reached out to other former employees, whistleblowers who had been silenced by Ashworth Global's intimidation tactics. Many were too afraid to come forward, the memory of their own ordeals still fresh. But a few, inspired by Brendan's defection and Scarlett's persistence, agreed to add their voices to the cause. One particularly difficult moment came when they uncovered evidence implicating Brendan's mother in some of the company's illegal activities. Brendan had always seen his mother as somewhat removed from the cutthroat world of finance, but the documents painted a different picture. "I can't believe it," Brendan said, his voice hollow as he stared at the incriminating emails. She knew everything." Scarlett placed a comforting hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Brendan. I know how much this must hurt." Brendan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "It does hurt, but it also makes me even more certain that we're doing the right thing. This corruption, it's infected my entire family. It has to stop." As they worked, Brendan and Scarlett's relationship continued to deepen. They found moments of joy amidst the stress, Family dinners with Max and Lily, quiet evenings spent talking about their hopes for the future, lazy Sunday mornings cuddled together in bed. Max and Lily too were blossoming. With stability and love, the children were coming out of their shells. Max's natural curiosity found an outlet in the books Brendan bought him, while Lily's artistic talents began to shine through in colorful drawings that soon covered the refrigerator. One evening, as they tucked the kids into bed, Lily reached out to Brendan. "Will you be our dad now?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Brendan felt his heart constrict. He looked at Scarlett, who nodded slightly, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I'd like that very much," Brendan said softly, squeezing Lily's hand. "If it's okay with you and your mom and Max." Max, never one to be left out, piped up from his bed. "Does this mean we get to stay here forever? In the big house with the view?" Scarlett laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Brendan's heart soar. "We'll see, sweetheart. But no matter where we live, we'll be together. That's what matters." As they left the children's room, Brendan pulled Scarlett close. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" she asked, looking up at him. "For giving me a family, a real one, built on love and trust, not obligation and secrets." Scarlett stood on her tiptoes, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "We gave each other a family, Brendan, and together we're going to make sure it's a family we can be proud of." As they settled into bed that night, both felt a sense of peace despite the battles that still lay ahead. They had each other, they had the children, and they had a shared purpose that gave their lives meaning. The next morning brought a new challenge. A package arrived, unmarked except for Brendan's name. Inside was a USB drive and a note that simply read, "You're not the only one who wants the truth to come out. Be careful who you trust." Brendan and Scarlett exchanged a look of mingled excitement and apprehension. Could this be the final piece of evidence they needed? Or was it a trap set by those who wanted to see them fail? As Brendan inserted the drive into his computer, both held their breath, knowing that whatever was on it could change everything. The screen flickered to life, revealing a trove of documents that made even Brendan, with all his insider knowledge, gasp in shock. "This is it," Scarlett breathed, her eyes wide as she scanned the files. "This isn't just about financial fraud. This is... God, Brendan, this is huge." Brendan nodded, his mind racing. "We need to be careful with this. If even half of what's here is true, we're not just taking on my family anymore. We're taking on some of the most powerful people in the country." Scarlett squared her shoulders, a fierce determination in her eyes. "Then that's what we'll do. We've come too far to back down now." As they dove into the new evidence, both Brendan and Scarlett felt the weight of what lay ahead. But they also felt stronger than ever, their partnership forged in adversity and strengthened by love. Whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together. And in doing so, they would redefine what it meant to be an Ashworth, building a legacy of integrity and justice that would far outlast any fortune. The New York skyline glittered in the pre-dawn light as Brendan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. Behind him, the living room was a war zone of documents, laptops, and empty takeout containers, the detritus of their months-long investigation. Scarlett's voice broke the silence. "Brendan, you're up early." He turned to see her padding towards him, wrapped in a robe, her hair tousled from sleep. The sight of her still made his heart skip a beat. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Today's the day." Scarlett nodded, understanding etched on her face. She took his free hand, intertwining their fingers. "Are you ready?" Brendan took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be. Once we do this, there's no going back." "Do you have any regrets?" Scarlett asked softly. Brendan looked at her, then glanced towards the children's rooms. "Only that I didn't meet you sooner," he said with a small smile. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city come to life below them. In a few hours, they would shake that city and the country to its core. The plan was set in motion. Brendan had arranged a press conference, ostensibly to address rumors about his split from Ashworth Global, but what the gathered reporters would hear would be far more explosive. As they prepared to leave, Max and Lily clung to them, sensing the tension in the air. "Do you have to go?" Lily asked, her small face scrunched with worry. Brendan knelt down, meeting her eyes. "We do, sweetheart. But we'll be back soon, and when we are, everything's going to be different. Better." Max, always the more practical of the two, asked, "Will we have to move again?" Scarlett ruffled his hair. Maybe, honey, but no matter what happens, we'll be together. That's what matters." With final hugs and kisses, they left the children in Mrs. Henderson's capable hands and headed out to face the world. The press conference was held in a hotel ballroom, packed to capacity with journalists from every major news outlet. As Brendan and Scarlett made their way to the podium, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Brendan raised his hands for silence, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "Thank you all for coming. I know there's been a lot of speculation about my departure from Ashworth Global Investments. Today I'm here to set the record straight." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. In the back he spotted his father and Marcus, their faces tight with barely contained fury. Brendan felt Scarlett's hand on his arm, a gentle reassurance. "What I'm about to tell you goes far beyond a simple corporate disagreement," Brendan continued. "For years, Ashworth Global has been at the center of a web of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of finance and government." A murmur ran through the crowd. Cameras clicked frantically. "I have evidence," Brendan said, his voice rising, "of systemic fraud, market manipulation, and the destruction of lives in the pursuit of profit, and I'm here today to expose it all." What followed was a meticulous presentation of their findings. Brendan and Scarlett tag-teamed, laying out the evidence with precision and passion. They showed emails, financial records, sworn statements from whistleblowers. With each revelation, the room grew more charged. "Ashworth Global didn't just bend the rules," Scarlett said, her voice clear and strong. "They broke them repeatedly and without remorse, and when anyone tried to speak up, they were silenced. I know, because it happened to me." She shared her story, her voice breaking only once as she described the impact on her children. Brendan watched her with pride and admiration, marveling at her strength. As they neared the end of their presentation, Brendan dropped the final bombshell. "But this goes beyond Ashworth Global. We have evidence implicating several major financial institutions, as well as high-ranking government officials, in this web of corruption." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, photographers jostled for better angles. In the chaos, Brendan saw his father stand and stride towards the exit, his face a mask of cold rage. "We are turning over all of our evidence to the SEC, the FBI, and the Department of Justice," Brendan announced over the din. "We call on these agencies to launch a full investigation and bring those responsible to justice." As they concluded, the room was in an uproar. Brendan and Scarlett were quickly ushered off the stage by their security team, the shouted questions of reporters following them. In a quiet room backstage, they finally had a moment alone. Scarlett collapsed into Brendan's arms, her body shaking with a mix of adrenaline and relief. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Brendan held her tight, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You were amazing out there," he said, "absolutely incredible." Their moment of peace was short-lived. Brendan's phone began to buzz incessantly, notifications pouring in faster than he could process them. "It's everywhere," he said, scrolling through the flood of messages and news alerts. "Every major network, every newspaper. Scarlett, we've opened Pandora's box." She nodded, a mix of excitement and apprehension in her eyes. There's no going back now. The next few days were a whirlwind. Brendan and Scarlett were inundated with requests for interviews, while their legal team worked around the clock to coordinate with federal investigators. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. Ashworth Global's stock plummeted, losing billions in value overnight. Several high-ranking executives, including Richard Ashworth, were taken in for questioning. The financial world was in chaos, as other institutions scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Brendan and Scarlett watched it all unfold from the relative safety of a secluded vacation home where they'd retreated with the children to escape the media frenzy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Max and Lily play in the yard, Scarlett turned to Brendan. "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?" she asked softly. Brendan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Every day," he admitted. "But then I look at you, at the kids, at all the people who've reached out to thank us, and I know we did." Scarlett leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "It's just the scale of it all. Sometimes it feels overwhelming." "I know," Brendan said, wrapping an arm around her. "But we're not in this alone. There are good people out there, in the government, in the media, who are picking up where we left off. The truth is out there now. It can't be buried again." Their conversation was interrupted by Brendan's phone ringing. He glanced at the screen and his face tightened. "It's my mother," he said. Scarlett squeezed his hand. "Do Do you want me to give you some privacy? Brendan shook his head. No, please stay. He answered the call, putting it on speaker. Hello, Mother. Brendan, Elizabeth Ashworth's voice came through, strained and tired. I don't know where to begin. How about with the truth? Brendan suggested, his tone carefully neutral. Did you know, Mother, about all of it? There was a long pause. Not everything, Elizabeth finally said, but enough. Enough that I should have done something. I'm so sorry, Brendan. Brendan closed his eyes, feeling a complex mix of emotions. I'm sorry too, Mother. I wish things could have been different. Your father, Elizabeth began, then stopped. Richard is facing indictment. Several indictments, actually. He's not handling it well. Brendan felt a pang of guilt, quickly suppressed. He made his choices, Mother, just like I made mine. I know, Elizabeth said softly. And for what it's worth, I'm proud of you, Brendan. What you did, it took incredible courage. The words hit Brendan hard, bringing unexpected tears to his eyes. Thank you, he managed. That means a lot. After a few more minutes of conversation, they said their goodbyes. Brendan sat in silence, processing the interaction. Scarlett simply held him, offering silent support. Finally, Brendan spoke. I never thought I'd hear her say she was proud of me. Not for this. Scarlett kissed his cheek softly. She should be. We all are. The next week brought a new challenge. Marcus Roth, Brendan's former right-hand man, had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. His deposition promised to be explosive, potentially implicating even more high-level players in the financial world. Brendan and Scarlett were asked to be present for the deposition, their testimony potentially crucial in corroborating Marcus's claims. As they entered the law offices where the deposition would take place, both felt the weight of the moment. Marcus was already there, looking haggard and nervous. When he saw Brendan, a complex mix of emotions crossed his face, shame, resentment, and a hint of grudging respect. Brendan, he nodded. Ms. Reeves. Marcus, Brendan replied evenly. Thank you for doing this. Marcus laughed bitterly, like I had a choice. It was this or go down with the ship. He paused, then added quietly, but for what it's worth, I'm glad the truth is coming out. It was eating me alive. As the deposition began, Marcus laid out a damning account of Ashworth Global's illegal activities. He corroborated much of what Brendan and Scarlett had already revealed, but also added new, shocking details. It wasn't just about money, Marcus explained. It was about power, control. Ashworth Global had politicians in their pocket, judges on their payroll. They could make or break entire economies with a single decision. Brendan listened, a mix of horror and vindication washing over him. Everything they'd suspected, everything they'd fought to expose was being confirmed and then some. At one point, Marcus turned to Brendan, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and regret. You know, Brendan, your father always said you were too soft for this business. But he was wrong. You're the strongest of all of us. You had the guts to stand up and say no more. The deposition lasted for hours. By the end, everyone in the room looked shell-shocked. The attorneys were already discussing next steps, the implications of Marcus's testimony rippling out like shockwaves. As they left the building, Brendan and Scarlett were met by a wall of reporters. Questions were shouted from all directions. Mr. Ashworth, what's your response to Marcus Roth's testimony? Ms. Reeves, how does it feel to finally be vindicated? Will you be pressing charges against your father, Mr. Ashworth? Brendan raised his hands for quiet. We've said all we're going to say for now. The proper authorities are handling the investigation. We ask for privacy as we continue to cooperate with their efforts. Thank you. As they pushed through the crowd towards their waiting car, a voice rose above the others. Mr. Ashworth, do you regret your actions given the economic chaos they've caused? Brendan paused, turning to face the reporter. Regret exposing corruption and standing up for what's right? Never. The short-term chaos is painful, yes, but it's necessary for real change. We can't build a just society on a foundation of lies and greed. With that, they ducked into the car, leaving the clamoring reporters behind. That evening, as they tucked Max and Lily into bed, the weight of the day's events hung heavy in the air. Mommy, Max asked, his young face serious. Are the bad guys going to jail? Scarlett smoothed his hair back. Some of them probably will, sweetheart, but it's complicated. The important thing is that they can't hurt people anymore. Lily looked up at Brendan with wide eyes. Are you a superhero now, like in the movies? Brendan chuckled, touched by her innocence. No, honey, I'm just a person who decided to do the right thing. Anyone can be a hero if they stand up for what's right. After the children were asleep, Brendan and Scarlett retreated to the porch, each nursing a glass of wine. The night was clear, stars twinkling above them in sharp contrast to the chaos of their lives. I got a call from my old boss at the firm I worked at before Ashworth Global, Scarlett said suddenly. They want me back. Said they were impressed by my integrity and courage. Brendan turned to her, surprised. That's wonderful, Scarlett. Are you going to take it? She was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure. After everything we've been through, going back to a regular 9 to 5 feels, I don't know. Small. Brendan nodded, understanding. You know, I've been thinking about that too, about what comes next. And, Scarlett prompted, I think we have an opportunity here to really make a difference. Brendan's eyes lit up with excitement. What if we started a foundation, something focused on corporate accountability, on protecting whistleblowers? Scarlett considered this, a slow smile spreading across her face. Using the Ashworth fortune for good. There's a certain poetic justice to that. Brendan grinned. Exactly. We could work with lawmakers to strengthen regulations, provide legal support to people fighting against corporate corruption, really change the system from the inside out. It won't be easy, Scarlett warned. We'll face a lot of opposition. When has that ever stopped us? Brendan countered, taking her hand. Together, I think we can do anything. Scarlett squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with determination and love. Together, she agreed. The next morning brought news that sent shockwaves through their world. Richard Ashworth, Brendan's father, had been found dead in his home office. The preliminary report suggested suicide. Brendan received the news with a numbness that frightened him. He stood in the middle of the living room, the phone slipping from his grasp, as Scarlett rushed to his side. Brendan, what is it? What's happened? My father, he managed, his voice hollow. He's dead, killed himself. Scarlett gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh, Brendan, I'm so sorry. The following days were a blur of funeral arrangements, press statements, and intense emotional turmoil. Brendan struggled with a maelstrom of feelings, grief, guilt, anger, and a pervasive sense of what if. The funeral was a tense affair. The once powerful Ashworth clan was divided, with some family members blaming Brendan for Richard's death, while others quietly expressed support for his actions. As Brendan stood by the graveside, Scarlett's hand clasped tightly in his, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see his cousin Michael, once a staunch ally of Richard's. I know some of the family blames you, Michael said quietly, but I want you to know, I think you did the right thing. Uncle Richard, he lost his way. Maybe if more of us had your courage, it wouldn't have come to this. Brendan nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Scarlett squeezed his hand, a silent pillar of strength. In the weeks that followed, as the legal proceedings continued and the financial world slowly began to stabilize, Brendan and Scarlett threw themselves into planning their foundation. They reached out to ethics professors, legal experts, and reformed corporate whistleblowers, building a network of allies committed to changing the system. One evening, as they sat surrounded by planning documents and laptops, Scarlett looked up at Brendan with a soft smile. You know, when I was at my lowest point huddled in that bus stop with the kids, I never could have imagined this. You've given us so much, Brendan. Brendan shook his head, reaching out to cup her cheek. No, Scarlett, you've given me everything. A purpose, a family, a chance to be the man I always wanted to be. As their lips met in a tender kiss, both felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. They had weathered the storm together and come out stronger on the other side. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still legal battles to fight, systems to change, and a lifetime of work ahead of them. But as they held each other close, Brendan and Scarlett knew that together they could face anything. The Ashworth name, once synonymous with greed and corruption, would be reborn. It would stand for justice, for integrity, for the power of ordinary people to stand up and make a difference. As they broke apart from their kiss, Brendan's phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced at it, his eyes widening. Scarlett, look at this, he said, turning the screen towards her. The headline read, Congress announces hearings on corporate accountability in wake of Ashworth scandal. Scarlett read it, a mix of excitement and apprehension crossing her face. They want us to testify, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brendan nodded, a determined gleam in his eye. This is our chance, Scarlett, to take what we've learned, what we've fought for, and use it to create real, lasting change. It won't be easy, Scarlett cautioned. We'll be up against powerful interests, lobbyists, people who benefit from the system staying exactly as it is. I know, Brendan agreed. But think about it. We've already accomplished what most people thought was impossible. We took down one of the biggest financial institutions in the world. We exposed corruption at the highest levels. If we can do that, we can do this. Scarlett smiled, her earlier caution giving way to determination. You're right, and we won't be alone. Think of all the people who've reached out to us, all the whistleblowers and activists who've been fighting this fight for years. We can give them a voice. As they discussed the implications of the congressional hearings, their excitement grew. This was more than just the next step in their journey. It was an opportunity to solidify the changes they'd fought so hard to bring about. We should reach out to some of the other whistleblowers, Scarlett suggested. Strength in numbers, right? Brendan nodded, already pulling up contacts on his laptop. Good idea. And we should talk to our legal team about the best way to present our evidence. We need to make sure it's airtight. As they worked late into the night, planning their strategy for the hearings, both felt a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation they'd been planning was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a necessity, a tool to continue the fight they'd started. The next morning, as they sat at breakfast with Max and Lily, Brendan and Scarlett exchanged a look. It was time to explain to the children what was happening, at least in terms they could understand. Kids, Brendan began, setting down his coffee cup. Your mum and I have some news. We've been asked to go to Washington, D.C. to talk to some very important people about the work we've been doing. Max's eyes widened with excitement. Are you going to meet the president? Scarlett laughed, ruffling his hair. Probably not, sweetheart, but we are going to talk to people who make laws. We're going to try to help make things better for a lot of people. Lily, always more perceptive than her years, asked quietly, Is it dangerous? Brendan and Scarlett exchanged a glance. They'd agreed never to lie to the children, but they also didn't want to frighten them unnecessarily. It's not dangerous, Brendan said carefully, but it is important, and it might mean that things will change for us again. We might be in the news more, and we might have to move again to be closer to where the work is. But no matter what happens, Scarlett added, reaching out to take both children's hands, we'll be together. That's the most important thing. As they finished breakfast and got the kids ready for school, Brendan and Scarlett felt the weight of what lay ahead. The congressional hearings would be challenging, potentially grueling, but they also represented a chance to cement the changes they'd fought so hard for, to ensure that their sacrifices, and those of so many others, hadn't been in vain. Later that day, as they met with their legal team to prepare for the hearings, Brendan received an unexpected call. It was from Elizabeth, his mother. Brendan, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I saw the news about the congressional hearings. I want you to know that I'm proud of you. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help. Brendan felt a lump form in his throat. Mum, thank you, that means a lot, but are you sure? This could get messy. It might mean speaking out against people you've known for years. I'm sure, Elizabeth said firmly. It's time I stood up for what's right, just like you did. Your father, he lost his way. But you, Brendan, you found yours. Let me help you stay on that path. As Brendan ended the call, he turned to Scarlett, tears shimmering in his eyes. My mother wants to help, he said, his voice filled with wonder. She wants to testify too. Scarlett embraced him, understanding the magnitude of this moment. That's wonderful, Brendan. It's never too late to do the right thing. As they resumed their preparations, both felt a renewed sense of hope. They had started this journey alone, two people against a seemingly insurmountable system. Now they were at the head of a growing movement, supported by allies from all walks of life. The path ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But as Brendan and Scarlett looked at each other, their hands intertwined, they knew they were ready. Together they had already changed the world, and together they would continue to fight for justice, integrity, and a better future for all. The stage was set for the next chapter in their story, one that would play out on a national stage, with the potential to reshape the very foundations of corporate accountability in America. As they finalized their preparations for the journey to Washington, both Brendan and Scarlett felt a mix of trepidation and exhilaration. This was what they had fought for, what they had sacrificed everything for, and now, finally, they had the chance to see it through to the end. The cavernous hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed, and reporters whispered urgently into microphones as Brendan Ashworth took his seat before the congressional panel. Scarlett sat just behind him, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of attention. "Mr. Ashworth," the committee chairwoman began, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "you've brought to light one of the most far-reaching corporate scandals in recent history. Can you tell us, in your own words, what motivated you to come forward?" Brendan leaned into the microphone, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Truth, Madam Chairwoman. The truth, and the belief that no one should be above the law, no matter how wealthy or powerful they may be." As the hearing unfolded, Brendan and Scarlett presented their evidence methodically, painting a damning picture of corporate malfeasance that stretched back decades. They were followed by a parade of witnesses, former Ashworth Global employees, financial experts, and even Elizabeth Ashworth, whose testimony sent shockwaves through the financial world. The hearings stretched on for days, dominating news cycles and sparking heated debates about corporate accountability and regulatory reform. Through it all, Brendan and Scarlett stood firm, their united front a powerful symbol of integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure. When it was finally over, they emerged from the Capitol building into a sea of reporters. Brendan fielded questions with a newfound confidence, Scarlett at his side. "Mr. Ashworth, what do you hope will come from these hearings?" Brendan's response was measured but passionate. "Change, real, lasting change. We've exposed the rot at the core of our financial system. Now it's time to clean it up, to create safeguards that protect ordinary people from corporate greed and corruption." As they made their way through the crowd, a young woman approached them, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Ashworth, Ms. Reeves," she said, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to thank you. My parents lost everything in the financial crash caused by companies like Ashworth Global. What you've done, it gives us hope." Scarlett squeezed the woman's hand, her own eyes misting. "That's why we did this," she said softly. "For people like you and your family." In the weeks that followed, the impact of their testimony reverberated through the corridors of power. New legislation was proposed, regulatory agencies were granted expanded oversight, and a wave of corporate reforms swept through Wall Street. Brendan and Scarlett found themselves at the center of a movement, their foundation inundated with offers of support and requests for help. They worked tirelessly, leveraging their newfound influence to push for meaningful change. But as the months wore on, the toll of their public battle began to show. Brendan noticed Scarlett growing quieter, more withdrawn. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their Washington apartment, she finally voiced what had been weighing on her mind. "Brendan," she began, her voice soft but determined, I think it's time for me to step back." Brendan felt his heart constrict. "What do you mean?" Scarlett turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "This fight, this public life, it's important work. But I look at Max and Lily and I realize they need stability, a chance at a normal life, away from all this scrutiny." "But we're making a difference," Brendan protested. "We're changing things." "We are," Scarlett agreed. "And you should continue. But the kids and I, we need to start over, somewhere quiet, where they can just be children, not symbols in a larger battle." Brendan was quiet for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally he nodded, tears pricking at his eyes. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't like it, but I understand." They spent the next few weeks making arrangements. Scarlett found a small town on the West Coast, far from the spotlight of Washington and Wall Street. It was a painful process, filled with tearful goodbyes and promises to stay in touch. The day of their departure arrived all too soon. As they stood in the airport, Brendan knelt down to hug Max and Lily. "You be good for your mom, okay?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And remember, no matter where you are, no matter how far apart we might be, we're always family." Lily clung to him, her small face buried in his shoulder. "Will you come visit?" she asked, her voice muffled. "Of course," Brendan promised. "As often as I can." As the children stepped back, Brendan turned to Scarlett. They looked at each other for a long moment, years of shared struggles and triumphs passing between them. "Thank you," Brendan said finally, "for everything. I wouldn't be who I am today without you." Scarlett smiled through her tears. "We changed each other," she said. "For the better, I think." They embraced, holding each other tightly. When they finally parted, Both felt the weight of an ending, but also the promise of new beginnings. "Take care of yourself, Brendan," Scarlett said. "And don't forget why we started all this. It's not just about exposing the bad, it's about building something good to take its place." Brendan nodded, wiping at his eyes. "I won't forget. I promise." As he watched them disappear through the security checkpoint, Brendan felt a chapter of his life closing. But rather than despair, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Scarlett and the children had given him a gift, a family, a moral compass, a reason to fight for a better world. Now it was up to him to honor that gift. In the years that followed, Brendan threw himself into his work with a passion that surprised even him. The Ashworth Foundation for Corporate Accountability became a powerful force for change, advocating for stricter regulations, supporting whistleblowers, and funding research into ethical business practices. Brendan's transformation from corporate scion to crusader for justice was complete. He testified before Congress multiple times, wrote books on corporate ethics, and became a sought-after speaker at universities and business schools. But despite his public success, Brendan never forgot the personal cost of his choices. He kept his promise to visit Scarlett and the children, treasuring the quiet weekends spent in their small coastal town. He watched Max and Lily grow, marveling at their resilience and the normal, happy life Scarlett had created for them. 5 years after their parting at the airport, Brendan found himself in San Francisco for a conference on sustainable business practices. On a whim, he decided to take a drive up the coast, drawn by memories and a lingering sense of unfinished business. As he walked along a windswept beach lost in thought, a familiar voice caught his attention. "Brendan, is that you?" He turned to see Scarlett standing a few yards away, a look of shocked recognition on her face. The years had been kind to her. She looked relaxed, at peace in a way he'd never seen before. "Scarlett," he breathed, a smile spreading across his face. "What are you doing here?" She laughed, gesturing down the beach. "We live here now. Just moved a few months ago. I can't believe... What are the odds?" They fell into step together, walking along the water's edge as they caught up on each other's lives. Scarlett had started a small consulting firm, helping local businesses implement ethical practices. The kids were thriving. Max was captain of his school's debate team, while Lily had discovered a passion for environmental science. "And you?" Scarlett asked. "I've seen you on the news testifying before Congress again. You've really made a difference, Brendan." Brendan shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I've tried, but sometimes I wonder if it's enough, if anything will ever really change." Scarlett stopped walking, turning to face him. "It is changing," she said firmly. "Maybe not as fast as we'd like, but it is. The work you're doing, it matters, Brendan. Don't ever doubt that." They stood there for a moment, the crash of waves providing a soothing backdrop to their reunion. Finally, Brendan spoke, his voice soft but clear. "I've missed you, Scarlett. All of you. I understand why you needed to leave, but there's been a hole in my life ever since." Scarlett's eyes softened. "We've missed you too. The kids still talk about you all the time, and She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I've often wondered what might have been, if things had been different." A charged silence fell between them, years of unspoken feelings hanging in the air. Then from further down the beach a voice called out, "Mum, Mum, where are you?" Scarlett turned, waving to the two figures approaching in the distance. "Over here." As Max and Lily drew closer, their eyes widened in recognition. "Brendan!" they shouted in unison, breaking into a run. Brendan found himself engulfed in a tangle of arms, the children's excited voices washing over him. As he hugged them back, he felt a sense of rightness of coming home. Looking over their heads, he met Scarlett's eyes. She was watching them with a soft smile, her expression a mixture of joy and something more complex. In that moment, Brendan realized that while their paths had diverged, the connection between them remained unbroken. They had been through too much together, changed each other too profoundly, for it to be otherwise. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the beach, Brendan made a decision. "I don't suppose," he began hesitantly, "there's room for one more in this little seaside town of yours?" Scarlett's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with understanding. "I think we might be able to arrange something," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. As they walked back up the beach, the children chattering excitedly between them, Brendan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight for corporate accountability, for a more just and ethical world, was far from over. But here, with Scarlett and the kids, he had found something equally important, a chance to build the family and the life he'd always longed for. The Ashworth name, once synonymous with corporate greed, now stood for integrity and positive change. And Brendan, the man who had risked everything to do what was right, had finally found his true home. In the months that followed, Brendan gradually transitioned his life to the small coastal town. He maintained his role at the foundation, but delegated more day-to-day responsibilities, allowing him to work remotely and focus on writing and strategic planning. The Ashworth Foundation for Corporate Accountability continued to thrive under his guidance, its influence growing as more whistleblowers and ethical business leaders joined the cause. Brendan's books on corporate reform became required reading in business schools across the country, sparking important conversations about the role of ethics in the corporate world. Scarlett's consulting firm also flourished, with her expertise in both finance and ethical business practices in high demand. Together, they became a formidable team, often collaborating on projects that bridged the gap between big business and local communities. Max and Lily, now teenagers, thrived in their new family dynamic. Max's debate skills, honed by years of dinner-table discussions about corporate responsibility, led him to win several national competitions. Lily's passion for environmental science blossomed into a youth-led initiative to protect the local coastline, earning recognition from state officials. One crisp autumn evening, as Brendan and Scarlett walked hand-in-hand along the beach, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "Do you ever regret it?" Scarlett asked, her voice barely audible above the crashing waves. "Giving up the Ashworth Empire, the life you were born into?" Brendan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I think about what might have been," he admitted. "The power, the influence I could have wielded from within the system. But then I look at what we've built instead, the lives we've changed, the reforms we've helped enact, and I know we made the right choice." Scarlett squeezed his hand. "We've come a long way from that rainy day in New York," she said with a soft laugh. "We certainly have," Brendan agreed, pulling her close, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As they stood there, watching the sun sink below the horizon, both felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had faced seemingly insurmountable odds, sacrificed much, and emerged stronger for it. The battle for corporate accountability was ongoing, but they had laid a foundation for change that would resonate for generations to come. More importantly, they had found each other, not just as partners in a cause, but as soulmates who had weathered storms together and come out stronger on the other side. The Ashworth name, once a symbol of unchecked corporate power, now stood for integrity, accountability, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And Brendan and Scarlett, once unlikely allies thrown together by circumstance, had become the heart of a movement that was slowly but surely changing the face of American business. As they turned to head back home, where Max and Lily waited with dinner and lively conversation, both felt a deep sense of contentment. They had rewritten the rules, redefined success, and in doing so had created a legacy far more valuable than any fortune. The story of Brendan Ashworth and Scarlett Reeves was far from over, but this chapter, one of redemption, of love found in the most unexpected places, of the power of individuals to effect real change, had come to a beautiful close. And as they walked hand in hand towards their future, both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger for the journey they had shared. 10 years had passed since that fateful day on the beach, when Brendan and Scarlett's paths had converged once again. The small coastal town they now called home had become a beacon of ethical business practices and community-driven initiatives, largely thanks to their combined efforts. On a warm summer evening, the Ashworth Reeves household buzzed with activity. The occasion was Max's graduation from law school, and friends and family had gathered to celebrate. The backyard of their modest but comfortable home was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Brendan stood at the grill, expertly flipping burgers while chatting with a group of Max's friends. His hair had grayed at the temples, and laugh lines framed his eyes, but there was an unmistakable air of contentment about him. Gone was the weight of expectation that had once burdened his shoulders. In its place was the quiet confidence of a man at peace with his choices. Scarlett emerged from the house, carrying a tray of homemade lemonade. She moved through the crowd with ease, her warm smile and genuine interest in each guest a testament to the life she had built here. As she approached Brendan, he instinctively reached out, their hands finding each other with the familiarity of long-time partners. "Max just called," Scarlett said, her eyes twinkling. "He's on his way with a surprise guest." Brendan raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Any hints?" Before Scarlett could respond, a commotion at the front of the house drew their attention. Max's voice carried over the crowd, filled with excitement. "Mom, Dad, we're here!" As Max appeared in the backyard, a young woman by his side, Brendan and Scarlett exchanged a knowing look. This was more than just a friend. "Everyone," Max announced, his face beaming. "I'd like you to meet Sophia. She's pretty special to me." Sophia, a petite woman with bright eyes and a determined set to her jaw, smiled shyly at the crowd. "It's wonderful to meet you all. Max has told me so much about this amazing family and community." As introductions were made and Sophia was warmly welcomed into the fold, Brendan and Scarlett found a quiet moment alone. "He looks happy," Brendan observed, watching Max laugh at something Sophia had said. Scarlett nodded, leaning into him. "He does. And did you hear? Sophia's heading to Washington for an internship with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Seems our boy has found someone who shares his passion for corporate accountability." Brendan chuckled. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I suppose." As the evening wore on, Lily arrived fresh from a research trip to the Galapagos Islands. At 25, she had become a rising star in the field of marine biology, her work on ocean conservation earning her recognition from international environmental organizations. With both children home, Brendan felt a swell of pride. Max and Lily had grown into thoughtful, passionate adults, each committed in their own way to making the world a better place. It was a legacy far more valuable than any financial empire. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to depart, Brendan found himself standing at the edge of the property, looking out over the ocean. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. "Mind if I join you?" It was Elizabeth, Brendan's mother, now in her 80s, but still sharp as ever. "Of course not," Brendan smiled, offering his arm for support. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the waves crash against the shore. "You know," Elizabeth said finally, "your father would be proud of you. The real him, I mean. The man he was before power and greed twisted him." Brendan felt a familiar pang at the mention of his father, but it was dulled by time and understanding. "I hope so," he said softly. "I've tried to honor the good parts of his legacy while correcting the mistakes." Elizabeth patted his arm. "You've done more than that, dear. You've redefined what the Ashworth name stands for. Justice, integrity, compassion. These are your legacy now." As they made their way back to the house, Brendan's eyes fell on Scarlett, who was deep in conversation with Lily about her latest research findings. The sight of her still made his heart skip a beat, even after all these years. Later that night, as Brendan and Scarlett prepared for bed, a comfortable routine honed by years of partnership, Scarlett broached a subject that had been on her mind. "I had an interesting call today," she began, settling into bed beside Brendan. "The governor's office reached out. They want me to head a new state commission on ethical business practices." Brendan turned to her, surprise and pride mingling in his expression. "Scarlett, that's incredible. Are you going to accept?" She hesitated. "I'm considering it. It would mean more time away from home, more public scrutiny, but the potential to effect real change at the state level." "You should do it," Brendan said without hesitation. "You've always been the heart of our mission, Scarlett. Your integrity, your compassion, that's what people respond to. You could do a lot of good in that position." Scarlett smiled, touched by his unwavering support. "What about you? Any plans to slow down?" Brendan chuckled. "Actually, I've been thinking of expanding the Foundation's youth outreach program. Start educating the next generation about corporate responsibility early." As they discussed their plans, both felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had come so far from that rainy day in New York, when a chance encounter had set them on this path. Yet in many ways they were still the same people at their core, driven by a desire to right wrongs and create a more just world. The next morning, as dawn broke over the ocean, Brendan stood on the beach, cup of coffee in hand. He thought back to that pivotal moment when he had offered Scarlett and her children a ride, defying years of ingrained behavior to follow a sudden impulse of compassion. In that moment, he had been a man adrift, wealthy and powerful, but empty inside. Now as he watched the sun rise over a world he had helped to change, he felt rich in ways he never could have imagined back then. The sound of laughter made him turn. Scarlett was walking towards him, Max and Lily flanking her, all still in their pajamas. Sophia trailed behind, already fitting in as if she'd always been part of the family. As they reached him, Scarlett slipped her hand into his, a gesture as natural as breathing. "Early riser as always," she teased gently. Brendan smiled, pulling her close. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he said softly. Max rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "Here they go again," he stage whispered to Sophia, who giggled. Lily, ever the peacemaker, suggested, "How about a family breakfast? I can make those blueberry pancakes everyone loves." As they turned to head back to the house, Brendan took one last look at the ocean. The waves rolled in, constant and ever-changing, much like the journey that had brought him here. He had lost an empire of wealth and power, but gained a kingdom of love, purpose, and true fulfillment. The Ashworth name now stood for something he could be genuinely proud of, a legacy that would outlive any fortune. With a contented sigh, Brendan turned away from the ocean and toward his family. Whatever the future held, he knew they would face it together, continuing to fight for what was right, to grow, to love. And in that moment, surrounded by the family he had found and the life they had built together, Brendan Ashworth knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Now it's your turn. What did you think of this story? I'd love to hear your rating from 0 to 10, and if you can, share what stood out the most to you. Every perspective adds a new layer to the narrative. Let's chat in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you missed our last story, here's a quick recap. Picture this scene. A generous millionaire crosses paths with a homeless young woman, desperate to feed her child. Moved, he gives her $300, thinking it's just a simple act of kindness. But what seemed like a one-time gesture takes on a deeper meaning when, the next day, he visits his late wife's grave, only to find the same woman kneeling before the headstone. What brought her there? And what's the real connection between them? This heartwarming story is full of mystery and a powerful life lesson. Click on the video on your screen now to uncover the surprising ending to this incredible journey. See you there.